That your original association with Zelig Harris was in the area of radical politics. You are identified with the New Left, whatever that is. You certainly have been an activist as well as a writer in anti-war, anti-Vietnam War. And you've said that the course of history may be determined to a very significant degree by what the people of the United States will have learned from the catastrophe, meaning, of course, the Vietnam War. What, in your opinion, have we learned from this experience?
I would say very little, unfortunately. At the time I wrote that, which I guess was 7 or 8 years ago, what I had in mind was that there are really two different ways of looking at this catastrophe. One can look at it as a failed venture, a mistake, something which was...
It was a mistake because it failed.
Mistake because it failed, but perfectly all right if it succeeded. And I think it's probably fair to say that at least among intellectuals, people who write and speak publicly. That
You've been rather harsh on the intellectuals.
Yeah, I think they're totally unprincipled on this. I mean, I think the dominant view is that if we had gotten away with it, it would have been all right, but we couldn't get away with it, so therefore it was stupid, and therefore we should get out. You know, worse than a crime, it was a blunder or something of that sort. Now, if that's all that's learned from it, I think it'll have no effect on future history. It will have shown that there are limits to American imperialism.
And your opposition has been on moral grounds, that it was wrong from the outset, although you said your opposition came 15 years too late.
Well, active opposition came 15 years too late. I think the time for active opposition should have been about 1950 or a little later. But I didn't become really actively engaged in opposing the war until about 1964, 65. And at that point, the United States was very deeply involved in what, if we were honest, we would call aggression against South Vietnam. That's in fact what it was. But I had, of course, always been opposed to the war. In fact, I was opposed to the Korean War, and it may surprise you, but I was even skeptical about the Second World War.
Are you a pacifist?
No, not a pacifist.
Are there justifications for war under certain circumstances?
Yeah, I can see justifications for a defensive war. I could, putting it all together, I think there are justifications for a war against Nazi Germany in the 40s. But I felt, I was a high school student at the time, but felt then, and have continued to feel, and in fact wrote about it in this book, that a good deal of the alleged justification for the war was totally beside the point, and that we were engaged in the war for reasons other than opposition to fascism or concern for you know, people being sent to gas chambers and things of that kind. In fact, those motivations, I think, were virtually non-existent. Nevertheless, despite the hypocrisy, and there was plenty, I think that war could be justified. And I'm not a pacifist in the sense of someone who believes that it is in principle wrong ever and always to undertake violent acts. I think you have to have a strong reason for it, very strong. The burden of proof is certainly on a person who wants to undertake the use of means of violence, but I believe occasionally that burden can be met.
The way in which you describe the Vietnam War, particularly, in your own words, is such that one would think that any good American, I use it in quotation marks, would totally reject the support of the Vietnam War. It's in your words, it stands for all that we're opposed to, oppression of other peoples and so forth. Now, either you would be wrong in your description, or there has to be a reason why the American would accept a war of this sort. Which is it? I guess you would never say it was a wrong description, of course. It's a stupid question from that point.
First of all, I'm not sure. See, we don't know what the population as a whole accepts or rejects because they're inarticulate largely. Among the people who are articulate, intellectuals, people who speak and write articles and so on, I think they've made it overwhelmingly clear that they consider the question of right or wrong irrelevant in the case of the United States. Of course, it's relevant if we're talking about some other country. For example, everyone would agree that it was wrong for the Russians to invade Czechoslovakia. That is, no one says, well, it was okay because they got away with it. But those criteria are never applied to ourselves, and that is totally unprincipled, though typical of, you know, other societies act this way as well. And it's that kind of lack of principle that I think has to be overcome, and the ideology behind it.
Being able to see ourselves as others see us, or as we see others, I suppose.
See ourselves by the principles that we occasionally enunciate. Apply those to ourselves. A lot of my own activity really has to do with the Vietnam War, and a good deal of my own energy goes into civil disobedience. Well, civil disobedience in the United States is an action undertaken in the face of considerable uncertainties about its effects. For example, it threatens the social order in ways which, let's say, one might argue, bring on fascism. That would be very bad for America, for Vietnam, for Holland, and for everyone else. So there's a danger, that is one danger in undertaking this concrete act. On the other hand, there's a great danger in not undertaking it. Namely, if you don't undertake it, the society of Indochina will be torn to shreds by American power. And in the face of those uncertainties, one has to choose a course of action.
Professor of linguistics at MIT and has been active in the peace movement. Professor Chomsky, why did Daniel Ellsberg do what he did?
Dan Ellsberg released to the American people information, historical information, about how a series of presidents enmeshed them in a vicious and costly war of aggression. He had every reason to believe that this war was continuing and would continue at the present incredible level of violence. And he hoped, I hope correctly, that if this historical information were brought to the American people, they would do something about it and stop that war.
May he in fact have had a duty to disclose the information?
I think he definitely had a duty, perhaps not a legal duty, but certainly a moral duty to bring to the public evidence about criminal acts. And that's in effect what the Pentagon Papers reveal. They are a history of a criminal conspiracy operating in secret to enmesh us in this war of aggression.
We're told that one of the harms of releasing the papers, though we aren't told exactly what, is harm to ongoing negotiations. Could that possibly be true?
Well, I don't recall, of course I haven't seen the full documents, but I don't recall a single instance in the documents that deals with ongoing negotiations. There is material, very interesting material about negotiations. For example, the documents reveal in 1964 that there was a concerted effort by the executive branch of the government to avoid negotiations which they called premature, because they knew that if negotiations took place at that time, and if there were a peaceful settlement, then the client government that they had instituted and were maintaining by force in South Vietnam could not maintain itself. So therefore they violated their legal obligation to avoid the threat and use of force and to pursue negotiations and other legal means. And they said, no, we have to act in such a way as to put off every negotiation effort. And we have to first, for example, William Bundy on August 11th, 1964 said, we first have to make sure they're hurting. We first have to apply the use of force. And then maybe after we've hurt them badly enough, then we can go to negotiations.
We've heard that Van Ellsberg's disclosure of these documents may have an inhibiting effect on similar confidential planning in the future. Is that something we should be afraid of?
I hope that it does have such an impact. If there is planning going on about engaging the United States in criminal acts of aggression, I think that information should be brought to the American public, or the right people to know about it and the right people to stop it.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky.
All right, Mr. Professor.
Mr. Chomsky, just to put your own views in the picture a little bit, in your book, American Power and the New Mandarins, you say that Americans should struggle to, and I'm quoting directly, to remove the heavy Yankee boot from the necks of oppressed peoples throughout the world.
Definitely.
That's your opinion.
Absolutely.
This is your notion of what the United States is doing, putting the heavy Yankee boot on the necks of oppressed peoples around the world.
Many such cases.
Certainly make it understandable why you feel the way you do. Would you favor prosecuting a person who avoided the draft in protest against the Vietnam War?
Certainly not. I've always supported draft resistance and will
What
continue
about
to.
a person who deserted?
No, I think that deserters should be supported.
In
fact, anyone who is resisting this illegal
What
war
about
should be
people who
supported.
destroy military files or ROTC property as a protest against the war?
Well, when you get to destruction, that becomes more ambiguous, but in many instances I would support
In
it.
many instances you would.
Yes.
What
I
about
wouldn't do it,
people
but I
who
would
would
support it.
derail a troop train?
That's even more difficult, because at that point
They're getting more difficult.
That's right, and I should say that you're not going to find any general principle that applies to this case. You have to deal with each particular instance. No, you have to deal with each particular instance on its merits.
Well, I'm dealing with this one. How about derailing a troop train?
No, I wouldn't do that because of the injury to the individuals.
Suppose nobody were injured.
If you could be certain in advance that no one would be injured, then I think it would be all right.
Troop train also.
For example, I would derail a train that was carrying live ammunition to be dropped on the people of Vietnam.
Should Ellsberg have revealed this material, assuming it was security matters having to do with ongoing operations affecting the Vietnam War?
That depends entirely on what the social consequences would be of revealing that information.
And who would determine that?
Well, in the case of very serious criminal acts, such as the act of, say, killing, maiming, and driving from their homes half the population of Vietnam, I think any American citizen has the right to make that decision.
Ellsberg himself is the one who would have to make the decision. Right?
Yes, because we're dealing with very significant and ongoing criminal actions.
What brought us to South Vietnam in the first instance, in my judgment, was clearly an uninterested, or I should say disinterested, concern for the stability and possibilities of a region of the world. What period
do you feel that we had this disinterested relationship to Vietnam?
Well, right now.
No, at what period did we have it? Did it begin? Let's say 1951, for example, when the State Department bulletin points out that we must help the French reconquer their former colony, and we must eradicate all Vietnamese resistance down to its last roots in order to reestablish the French in power. Was that disinterested?
To increase my vulnerability, I wish we had helped the French.
We did. We supported
not
them.
Sufficiently. Not sufficiently.
Well, but
there's no point in helping somebody insufficiently.
It was hardly disinterested when we attempted, as you know, with tremendous support, in fact, to reinstate French imperialism in South Vietnam.
Even to an imperialist phase, but we pulled out of it faster than any country in the history of civilization.
I think we're very deep.
Why did we pull out of the Philippines, for instance?
We pulled out of the Philippines because it became a bad investment.
Why?
Because if you look, American agricultural interests were very much opposed to the. Back in the mid-30s, they were very strongly opposed to the free trade relationships which allowed Philippine crops to compete with them. That's why we pulled out of the Philippines.
Why do these agricultural interests authorize us to intervene in South Vietnam?
They did.
If you consider this is
because we didn't intervene on
the critical dimension.
No, I say that in the Philippines it was the critical dimension. Look, the world is a complex place.
I'm aware of
there
that.
are certain interests that were involved.
MIT is a complex place.
Well, there were certain interests that were involved in our Philippine venture. There are different interests that are involved in our Vietnam venture. You see, our Vietnam. Don't forget that with the Second World War, America's imperial interests expanded enormously. I mean, prior to the Second World War, we were sort of a marginal imperialist power, except for the Monroe Doctrine. But since the Second World War, we became the world's major imperialist power. And Vietnam is simply one piece of an attempt to construct a very large integrated world system, of which Greece was another piece. But in actual fact, the history of colonialism shows that these two motivations can coincide. That is, practically every, I mean, there are exceptions, you know, probably the Belgians and the Congo are an exception. But by and large, the major imperialist ventures have been in the economic in the material interest or in the perceived material interest.
I'm not interested in the mathematics of the
let me finish.
You have already conceded that it's not merely a conceptual difference.
I say it is.
There are exceptions.
There are a few exceptions.
All right.
Like say
okay. All right, let's talk about the exceptions then.
Well, no, but the exceptions are at the difference. No, wait a minute. The exceptions, I mentioned, for example, the Belgians in the Congo. There they didn't even pretend to have a civilizing mission. There it was pure material self-interest. These are the exceptions. There are, as far as I know, no exceptions on the other side. There are, I mean, maybe I've left out a case of history, but as I see the history of colonialism, the great massive cases are cases where a powerful country was working in its perceived material self-interest and was covering what it was doing to itself and to the world with very pleasant phrases about preserving Christian values or helping the poor benighted natives or one thing or another. Now, there are a few exceptions where there's pure predatory imperialism. No, not even any pretense of doing anything, but these are quite rare.
But not say the war is simply an obscenity, a depraved act by weak and miserable men.
Including all of us, including myself,
well,
including that's the next sentence, same sentence.
Sure, because you count everybody in the company of the guilty.
I think that's true in this case.
Yeah, but
see, one of the points I was trying...
This is a sense of theological observation, isn't it?
No, I don't think so.
Because as somebody points out, if everybody's guilty of everything, then nobody's guilty of anything.
No, I don't. Well, no, I don't believe that. See, I think the point that I'm trying to make, and I think ought to be made, is that the real, at least to me, I say this elsewhere in the book, what seems to me a very, in a sense, terrifying aspect of our society and other societies is the equanimity and the detachment with which sane, reasonable, sensible people can observe such events. I think that's more terrifying than the occasional Hitler or LeMay or other that crops up. These people would not be able to operate were it not for this apathy and equanimity. And therefore I think that it's, in some sense, the sane and reasonable and tolerant people who share a very serious burden of guilt that they very easily throw on the shoulders of others who seem more extreme and more violent.
So what's the story of young Noam in the schoolyard?
Yeah, I mean, that was personal thing for me. I don't know why it should interest anyone else, but I do remember.
Well, you drew certain conclusions.
Well, yeah, I mean, it had a big influence on me. I mean, I remember when I was about 6, I guess, first grade. There was the standard fat kid who everybody made fun of, and I remember in the schoolyard he was on a, standing on a right outside the school classroom, and a bunch of kids outside sort of taunting him, and so on. And one of the kids actually brought over his older brother, so like from 3rd grade instead of 1st grade, big kid, and he was going to beat him up or something. And I remember going up to stand next to him, feeling somebody ought to help him, and I did for a while, and then I got scared and I went away, and I was very much ashamed of it afterwards, and sort of felt, not going to do that again. That's a feeling that's stuck with me. You should stick with the underdog. The shame remained. You should have stayed there.
You were already established. You were a professor at MIT. You'd made a reputation. You had a terrific career ahead of you. You decided to become a political activist. Now, here is a classic case of somebody whom the institution does not seem to have filtered out. I mean, you were a good boy up until then, were you? Or you'd always been some you were a rebel?
Yeah, pretty much. I had been pretty much outside.
You felt isolated. You felt out of sympathy with the prevailing currents of American life, but a lot of people do that. Suddenly, in 1964, you decide, I have to do something about this. What made you do that?
Well, that was a very conscious decision and a very uncomfortable decision, because I knew what the consequences would be. I was in a very favorable position. I had the kind of work I liked. We had a lively, exciting department. The field was going well. Personal life was fine. I was living in a nice place, children growing up. Everything looked perfect, and I knew I was giving it up. And at that time, remember, it was not just giving talks. I began involved right away in resistance. And I expected to spend years in jail and came very close to it. In fact, my wife went back to graduate school in part because we assumed she's going to have to support the children. These were the expectations. And I recognized that if I returned to these interests, which were the dominant interests of my own youth, life would become very uncomfortable. Because I know that in the United States, you don't get sent to a psychiatric prison, and they don't send the death squad after you, and so on. But there are definite penalties for breaking the rules. So these were real decisions. And it simply seemed at that point that it was just hopelessly immoral not to. I'm Noam Chomsky. I'm on the faculty at MIT, and I've been getting more and more heavily involved in anti-war activities for the last few years.
Something happening here.
Beginning with writing articles and making speeches and speaking to congressmen and that sort of thing, and gradually getting involved more and more directly in resistance activities of various sorts. I've come to the feeling myself that the most effective form of political action that is open to a responsible and concerned citizen at the moment is action that really involves direct resistance, refusal to take part in what I think are war crimes, to raise the domestic cost of American aggression overseas through non-participation and support for those who are refusing to take part, in particular draft resistance throughout the country.
Getting so much resistance from behind. Time we stopped. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going.
I think that we can see quite clearly some very, very serious defects and flaws in our society, our level of culture, our institutions, which are going to have to be corrected by operating outside of the framework that is commonly accepted. I think we're going to have to find new ways of political action.
In the street, singing songs and carrying signs, mostly said for our side. It's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Why did the business press believe that the war had basically been won by 1969? it's an unusual view. The usual story is the U.S. lost. In fact, that's supposed to be a terrible loss. Well, whether the U.S. won or lost depends on which war aims you're looking at. There were maximal aims and there were basic aims. The maximal aims were to turn Indochina into actually what was described as the model, described openly as the model, namely Indonesia after 1965. Indonesia in 1965, U.S.-backed, partly instigated military coup led by General Suharto. It killed about maybe 1 million people, mostly landless peasants, wiped out the only mass-based political party in the country, instituted a regime of torture and oppression and violence. It was called by the CIA one of the worst mass murders of the 20th century. They compared it to Hitler and Stalin. It wasn't concealed here. The New York Times described it as a staggering bloodbath, which was a gleaming light in Asia because the independent, the main party of the poor was totally wiped out and the country was opened up to Western exploitation. So that was the model. And it's true that the United States did not succeed in imposing that model on Indochina. So in that respect, it was a failure, and the U.S. lost the war, couldn't create an Indonesia. On the other hand, if you look at the major war aims, that wasn't what it was at all. This is incidentally a case where Vietnam is quite different from Iraq. In Vietnam, the U.S. had no particular interest in maintaining control over Vietnam, quite unlike Iraq. The goal in Vietnam, the basic war aim in Vietnam was to destroy the country, and for good, rational reasons, which they explained in places like Harvard and MIT. The problem was that they were concerned that an independent Vietnam might undertake a course of development that would become a kind of a model that others in the region would want to follow. It's what's called in internal documents a virus that might infect others. And when you have a virus that might infect others, you have to destroy the virus and inoculate the others. And that what was done, the virus was destroyed, never going to be a model to anybody. And the potential victims were inoculated, like in Indonesia with the staggering mass slaughter that was a gleaming light in Asia. And the same in surrounding countries, Marcos in the Philippines and so on. And the concern about the spread of the infection was very deep. So George Kennan, for example, was afraid that, when he was one of the top planners, that infection in Indonesia might spread throughout all of South Asia, even threatening the U.S. position in the Middle East, a crucial area where the world's energy is. And it was feared that the Vietnamese virus might extend as far as Indonesia. And if that happened, Japan, it was John Dower here described Japan as the super domino. Japan might have to accommodate to the Asian mainland, becoming its industrial and technological center in an independent area, and that would in effect recreate what Japan was trying to achieve during World War II. They called the co-prosperity sphere, which would mean that the United States would have lost the Second World War. And the United States government was not prepared in the late 1940s to lose the Second World War. And Vietnam, as John F. Kennedy put it, was the keystone in the arch. I mean, if that one fell, as it was called, that is, moved towards independence, the rot would spread, the virus would infect others, and you could have, it could turn out to be terrible. Kennan, incidentally, had no objection to restoring to Japan what he called its empire toward the south, that is, its co-prosperity sphere, and the United States, in fact, did that, but this time it was under U.S. control, so it was okay. That's why Kennan supported reconstructing the Japanese world order, but of course under U.S. control. And Vietnam was regarded as a keystone of the arch for that. Well, by 1968, it was pretty clear to anyone with eyes open that Vietnam would be lucky to survive. It wasn't going to be a model for anyone. The virus was destroyed. The region had been inoculated. So the war became, as McGeorge Bundy later said, former Harvard dean who was national security advisor for Kennedy, he said after 1965, with the mass slaughter, staggering mass slaughter in Indonesia, he said the U.S. war in Indochina became excessive. In other words, costing us too much. So it was kind of like a bad tactical decision to keep going after the basic war aims had been won. That's the core of the issue, I think, and that's why business turned against the war by 1968, and a year or two later at the extreme dissident left of intellectual opinion, you were allowed to call the war a mistake that began with blundering efforts to do good. Well, the idea that's in the heads of the population that it was fundamentally wrong and immoral and not a mistake, that has to be driven from their minds, clearly. And there have been huge efforts to do that ever since with kind of mixed effects. So, for example, knowledge of the war is extraordinary in the United States. There was actually there's only been one major academic study, as far as I know, of what people believe about the war, and it's mind-boggling. A couple of years ago, they found that people were asked to give an estimate of the number of Vietnamese who died during the war, and the mean estimate was 100,000, which is about 5% of the official U.S. figure and probably 2 or 3% of the actual figure. The authors of the study point out that it's as if you took a poll in Germany and asked people how many Jews died in the Holocaust, and the mean judgment was 300,000, in which case we'd think that there's a slight problem in Germany. But here, it's kept from us. We're not supposed to think about it. In the midst of 1969, which incidentally happened to be the peak period of U.S. atrocities in South Vietnam, that was the post-Tet accelerated pacification campaign, which was carrying out extraordinary atrocities, of which one became famous, My Lai, which became famous because you could blame it on poor, uneducated, half-crazed GIs in the field who didn't know who was shooting at them next, and did commit an atrocity. But as it happened, that was a minor footnote to a major mass murder campaign, Operation Wheeler Wallowa, which was organized by nice guys like us and sitting in air-conditioned offices who were plotting B-52 raids on villages and killing who knows how many tens of thousands of people. So therefore they're immune because they're our kind. But My Lai was those guys. So you're allowed to be angry about it. In fact, there was a Quaker clinic in Quang Ngai province working right where My Lai was. They knew about the atrocity immediately, but they didn't even bother reporting it because it was happening every day. Okay, what's the big deal? Here's just another one. Those are the real stories, but not the ones we know. Anyway, that's the question. Those are the kind of questions that would arise if there was even concern, let alone obsession, about what actually happened in Vietnam among liberal intellectual elites, but there isn't. The 1962, when Kennedy escalated from a Latin American-style terror state, which had killed who knows how many tens of thousands of people, escalated to an outright war. 1962 was the year when the U.S. Air Force, when Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam, authorized the use of napalm, initiated the use of chemical warfare to destroy food crops so as to drive the population into the concentration camps, which had been given various names, ultimately many millions of them. The story was that they had to be protected behind barbed wire from the South Vietnamese resistance, which they were willingly supporting. And there was no controversy over the fact that they were willingly supporting them. That was understood. It was recognized on all sides. You look at the internal documents and so on, they agreed that it was a political war against a military war. The South Vietnamese had political strength and the U.S. had military strength. So therefore the U.S. naturally shifted the war to the arena in which they could in which they could prevail, military strength, which is why the atrocities took place. The South Vietnamese who were the victims of the war were labeled aggressors, or as some put it, Adlai Stevenson, liberal hero, Kennedy's ambassador to the UN, they called it internal aggression. Interesting new concept. It was an assault from within, according to John F. Kennedy. And the terminology made some sense. The technical definition of aggression in U.S. Army manuals included as one type of aggression political warfare. That's one type of aggression. So yes, they were indeed the aggressors in their own country, and we were defending ourselves by slaughtering them. And the U.S. was entirely aware of this. So Kennedy's ambassador in South Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge, was cabling back that the generals are all we've got. We've lost everybody else. But there's a problem with the generals. He said, they have not been able to construct an efficient police state like Hitler's Germany. So therefore we've got some problems. We've got to get over this and let them do it. Well, return to the reshaping of history. After the war, when you have to start reconstructing it the right way in people's minds, we get to say President Carter, 1977, who gave his view of the war. This again is at the kind of liberal extreme. He said, we owe Vietnam no debt because the destruction was mutual. You want to see how mutual it was, take a walk in Plains, Georgia, and the Mekong Delta, and you'll see. But what's interesting about that comment is that it received no reaction. Nobody was appalled. Yeah, okay. Destruction was mutual, so we don't owe them any debt. By the time you get to Bush #1, there's a much harder line. There is a debt. It's theirs. They're the ones who are guilty. The destruction was not mutual. It took place here in Texas. But he said, we're nice guys, so in his words, we seek only answers without the threat of retribution for the past. In other words, we're willing to forget all the crimes that you committed against us, and we only seek answers because we're such nice guys. Now, what are the answers? Well, the answers are to the one moral issue that remains after destroying South Vietnam, namely the missing in action, who were somehow shot down over Iowa, by some strange way. But as long as that gets answers, everything's fine. We don't need any answers about the millions of corpses in South Vietnam or about the hundreds of thousands of victims of chemical warfare, which we have recently learned, though it doesn't get reported, was at about twice the intensity of what was reported during the war, and according to U.S. analysts, left about 2.1 million victims. We don't have to need answers for the deformed fetuses in Saigon hospitals and the people who are still dying, including people who born years after the chemical warfare officially stopped, but are still contracting serious diseases, cancer and mutilation and so on. We don't have to ask about that, and in fact it almost never gets reported. It's been known for 40 years that there are two versions of the domino theory. There's a public version, which is, Ho Chi Minh's going to get into a canoe and come to San Francisco and rape your grandmother. That's the public version. And that, of course, everybody always regarded was ridiculous internally. That's for the public. On the other hand, there's an internal version of the domino theory which has never been questioned and is still not questioned. And the reason is because it's true. The the other version is what Long just pointed out. And this just runs right through the whole post-war history, and it has sources way back through the history of Western imperialism. If there is successful independent development somewhere, it might appeal to people nearby who are suffering from the same problems. And therefore, you've got to kill the virus at its source and inoculate the region from infection. That version of the domino theory is correct, And that's why it has never been questioned internally. Never. Nothing in the internal record questioning it. And in fact, it continues to go on over and over. And not particularly Vietnam. I mean, so take Cuba. I mean, Kennedy in general, I'll come to the second question in a minute, but he was a super hawk. Not only in Vietnam, where he was one of the most hawkish members of the administration, but also in Cuba. And we know the reasons, because we have a rich internal documentary record. Actually, the reasons were pointed out right away before, just as he was coming in by his Latin American advisor, Arthur Schlesinger, supposedly way on the left. He led the Latin American mission, which informed Kennedy that what he said is the threat, if Cuba, is the threat of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands, which might appeal to other people in the region who are suffering from similar problems similar to those of the horribly oppressed Cuban population in this, what had been an American colony. And if that idea spreads, well, the dominoes start falling. And we can't accept that. That version of domino theory has never been questioned, and there's a good reason, because it's correct. In fact, it's the core principle of intervention. Actually, the truth of the matter is that even the Cold War itself falls into that pattern. You go back to the concerns of Woodrow Wilson and Lloyd George and others at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. What they were concerned with was this was a third world country, huge country, but a deeply impoverished peasant society, basically a colony of Western Europe. And they were much concerned that independent, successful development in Russia might infect others. They were even concerned that it would affect Britain and the United States. And that's the reason for the immediate intervention. Kill the virus. Well, Russia's a different scale than Grenada. Grenada you can get rid of in a weekend. Russia may take 70 years, but that and, threaten nuclear war and so on and so forth. But those are issues of scale. The principles are the same. As for Kennedy being, look, of course Kennedy was carrying, like every president is always carrying out any number of back-channel efforts to see if there's some other way out of things. They'd be insane if they didn't. But we have a very rich record of the Kennedy administration. Actually, I wrote a book about it a few years ago, which went through the whole documentary record. Kennedy was at the hawkish end of the administration. Without exception, he wanted withdrawal, but so did they all. Nobody wanted to stay there. It was unpopular at home, it's crazy and so on. But every single case, it's always withdrawal after victory. Okay, so after we can ensure that our client regime can control South Vietnam, fine, then we'll withdraw. I mean, if you take it literally, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, what's the point of speaking truth to McGeorge Bundy or Henry Kissinger? I mean, they know the truth. They don't want to hear it from us. We have nothing to tell them. So speaking truth to power is a total waste of time. What isn't a waste of time is trying to tell the truth about power. Now, that makes sense. But then what you're doing is engaging with the general population and trying to become involved. And you don't speak truth to them either. After all, who the hell am I? Why should I tell truth to the population? What you try to do is what a good teacher does. You try to encourage people to figure it out for themselves and then do something about it. So what you should be doing is engaging with other people to try to use whatever, good fortune you have, maybe privilege, resources, training, whatever it may be, to help them try to figure out the truth for themselves. Now, that makes sense, and get them to overthrow power, not to talk truth to it. As far as the history is concerned, I mean, there's kind of some real truisms. I mean, I hate to say them because they're so obvious. I mean, the more freedom and privilege you have, the more opportunity you have. Okay? Now, that's just elementary. The more opportunity you have, the more responsibility you have. Okay? And responsibility to do something useful with the privilege and freedom that you enjoy. And we do enjoy an enormous amount of freedom and privilege. It was never given to us by the powerful. It was fought for by the powerless, and they won it, and they achieved it, and you got to defend it, and you got to use that legacy to go on. But the fact of the matter is that people like us are uniquely free and from oppression. I mean, a lot of people complain about it, but the kind of repression that exists in places like this, the United States, is minuscule as compared with what happens elsewhere in the world. I mean, take, say, U.S. colonies, okay? So here's something else interesting about ourselves. We just passed the 25th anniversary of the assassination of the Archbishop of El Salvador, who was known as a voice for the voiceless. He was trying to speak for the poor. He was killed by forces, that we armed and trained. That set off the beginning of a decade of monstrous atrocities in El Salvador, run by the guys now in office, which ended symbolically in 1989 by the murder of 6 leading intellectuals, Jesuit intellectuals, priests, had their heads blown off by elite military forces armed and trained and directed by the United States, who had already compiled a record of, killing tens of thousands of the usual victims, peasants, working people, and so on. How much commemoration was there in Cambridge of the 25th anniversary of the assassination of the Archbishop and the 15th anniversary of the murder of 6 leading Latin American intellectuals? In fact, who in Cambridge could even tell you their names, let alone have read anything they wrote? Okay, now do a small thought experiment. Imagine that something like this had happened, to say, in Czechoslovakia. Okay, so in 1980, the Archbishop was assassinated by Russian-backed forces, and in 1989, Václav Havel and half a dozen of his associates had their heads blown off by elite Czech forces armed and trained by the Russians. Would we know about it? You bet. Would there be a commemoration? I mean, you're screaming to the heavens. In fact, we could have had a nuclear war because we're so outraged by what they did. When we do it, it's gone. There was no, to my knowledge, there was no commemoration of any of this in Cambridge. There was in Boston, but not in Cambridge. There was in a church in downtown Boston. But, that's part of the difference between educated elites who are protected from knowledge and understanding. That's a large part of what education's about. And people who don't have those advantages of being defended from the truth and being indoctrinated. Okay, that tells you something about intellectuals. The Jesuit intellectuals who were murdered in El Salvador at our hands, and the Archbishop the same, they were not speaking truth to power. They were trying to help people understand what was happening to them and do something about it. So they got their heads blown off. That's not going to happen to us. And the same is true in quite a few other countries in the world, where intellectuals do not simply serve power and support violence and terror, but actually protest against it, sometimes very bravely, facing real serious repression, assassination, for example, or torture in prisons. I mean, the fact that we don't do it is just criminal. But to answer your other question, there's nothing new about that. I mean, the history of intellectuals is written by intellectuals, almost by definition. So therefore, it's pretty. It sounds pretty. Like if you had a history of taxi drivers written by taxi drivers, that would sound pretty too. But you have to ask yourself, can we believe the history of themselves written by intellectuals? Well, in order to answer that question, you have to look at the facts. And it turns out the facts are quite different. Overwhelmingly, intellectuals have been servants of power.
The Russians don't keep their promises because they are a nation like other nations. In fact, the fact is anyone who believes the promises of any nation state is out of their minds or just doesn't know anything about history, and that includes us and every other one. I mean, states follow their promises if it's in their interest to do so, and the point is to try to create a system of shared interest which will bring about a certain degree of observance to international agreements. Now, if we look at it that way, then it seems to me the Russian record is certainly no worse than ours. Separate question is what kind of a threat it poses. Those are very entirely separate questions. I mean, you could have the most brutal, murderous society internally, which just wouldn't happen to be a threat outside. You have the freest. In fact, through history, there has been no correlation that I can detect between the internal freedom of a society and its violence and aggression abroad. For example, England was the freest country in the world in the 19th century, and in India it acted like the Nazis did. You know, the United States is, in my view, the most open, politically speaking, forgetting social issues and so on. It's the most open and freest society in the world, and it also has the most brutal record of violence and aggression in the world. Now, these things are just uncorrelated. Now, if you look at the Soviet Union, it seems to me, yes, it is a repressive, and dissent is suppressed, and it's, in my view, it's a dungeon. It's kind of a dungeon with a certain degree of social services. Now, and it is also a threat. It's a threat to the government. It's a threat to its own population. It's a threat to, in fact, anyone within its reach. But its reach doesn't happen to be very long. I mean, its reach is far shorter than we claim it to be. So for the population of the Soviet Union, for Eastern Europe, for Afghanistan, the Soviet Union is a real threat, and I don't see how anybody can question that. And the fact of the matter is that the Russians, in their international behavior, behave very much like any other power, including us. I mean, every power, great or small, tries to extend the influence of the extent of its degree to coerce and control and penetrate markets and so on and so forth, get resources. We happen to be the world's most powerful force. In the early post-war period, we were overwhelmingly the world's most powerful force, and therefore the United States did, in fact, we can easily document this both in the documentary record and the historical record, the United States did, in fact, set forth on a policy of global domination. And it succeeded to a surprising extent. Since that period, and the Russians did so also in their much smaller sphere. Now, since that period, this bipolar system has, in fact, eroded. I mean, other powers have developed, Europe, Japan, elements of the Third World, and in fact, the degree of the two superpowers to coerce and control us in our huge domains and them in their smaller domains, that has declined. Could point out that again, it's quite general, every society perceives itself or tries to make its public perceive itself as benevolent. I mean, the British were carrying the white man's burden, and the French had a civilizing mission, and the Russians are doing their internationalist duty when they invade Afghanistan, and the United States is preserving democracy. And all of this, I mean, we are as much interested in democracy as the Russians are interested in socialism. In fact, we, over and over again have overthrown democratic regimes if they didn't do the kind of thing we wanted them to do. I mean, study after study has revealed the obvious, namely that American support and aid correlates essentially with the improvement of the investment climate. If a country is willing to open itself to our penetration and control our access to resources, allow our corporations to repatriate profits and so on, we will support them. Doesn't matter what kind of regime they have.